competition where participants would wander around the countryside on a hunting spree and shoot at every bird and small mammal that they saw. And at the end of the day, teams tallied their kills in big piles, and the side that won, or the side that had more kills, was the winner for the day. At the turn of the century, a fellow by the name of Frank Chapman, an early ornithologist, pictured here, at the time he was the curator of natural history at the American Museum, and he was also the editor of a bi-monthly magazine called Bird Lore. So he had already started to notice that there were species declining in North America and had probably already witnessed some extinctions. So in protest of the somewhat unnecessary side hunt, he suggested that people count birds instead. So some early citizen scientists birding here, and a lot has changed, I think, since then, especially when it comes to birder dress code. But anyway, in the year 1900, the first Christmas bird count took place. Although there's far less bloodshed nowadays, there is still a competitive aspect that carried over from the side hunt, I will say. So on Christmas Day, yeah, 25 counts were conducted, including 2 in Canada. And this is actually a scan of the 1901 printing of Bird Lore, which later became Audubon magazine. And this is where the first ever Christmas bird counts were summarized. It was called the Christmas bird census at the time. So the summaries included effort, weather, total species, individuals, and some highlights. And here you can see we have Scotch Lake, New Brunswick, and Toronto, Canada. The very first to ever summarize Christmas bird counts were Canadians. So we as Canadians were represented right from the beginning. Most of us know how the CBC works, so I'll review this part pretty quickly. The concept, which hasn't changed in a century, is a simple one. Pick a day within the count period for a defined location, record effort, how many people, time spent, distance traveled, and we're going to talk a little bit more about why that part is so important, and then count birds. Here's a calendar for December and early January. And so we'll talk about a bit about some of the terminology here. So a count period is defined as the area between December 14 and January 5th each year. So an official Christmas bird count has to be conducted within those dates each year. So a count day, shown here by the star, in this case December 19th, it has to be conducted on one calendar day. And then the 3 days prior to and after count day are what's part of the count week, okay? So count week is a time where presence and absence data are collected for species that are not found on a count day. It gives us a little bit more of a complete picture of what might be around in case certain species aren't detected, but really it's this count day that we pick that's what matters. This is what a CBC looks like on a local scale. Each circle study area is 15 miles or 24 kilometers in diameter, centered on a point of interest, usually an urban center like a city or a park or natural area. This is, for example, the Ladner Christmas bird count. And you can see that a circle is usually divided up into smaller areas or sectors. And then often complex circles like Vancouver and Ladner are further divided with even smaller sub areas or zones. And an area like this can have 3 or 4 even smaller delineations within it. So we'll zoom out a little bit and look at the Metro Vancouver area. We've got Vancouver, Ladner, White Rock, Surrey, Langley, Pitt Meadows, Mission Abbotsford. So this is what the circles look like from a sort of a zoomed out scale. And then if we zoom out even further, we get really a better sense of how much coverage there really is. There are over 460 CBCs in Canada alone. And you can see that most of them are in places where people are, And fortunately, there are actually more birds in these places too. We have counts representing up north, including the most northerly count of all up on Baffin Island, which is Rankin Inlet, Nunavut. And to paint a bit of a picture about what it's like to be on a Christmas bird count above the Arctic Circle, just try to imagine you have about 45 minutes of light to count ravens. And if you're lucky, you'll get a ptarmigan. In the odd year, if there's a little bit of open water, there might be some eiders or rare sparrows, but really you're looking at 2 or 3 species max up here. And they're often referred to as CRCs, or Christmas raven counts, for that reason. So count week, as you can imagine, becomes more important for these circles because they often face challenging weather conditions. So to really capture that one rare sparrow or whatever that's hanging around, you have 3 days before and after the count day to get it. Let's take a closer look at effort. And I'll start by saying that this program is entirely citizen science driven, like volunteer driven. It's birders and naturalists. I think we all know what citizen scientists are, but I'll just say it's so anyone who is a member of the public who doesn't have any formal training in biology or anything like that, but has an interest and knowledge in the natural world. So totally driven by citizen science. Most people fall in this category here, which are field counters and feeder counters. So if you've participated on a CBC, you've probably been either a field counter or a feeder counter. So the field counters, they go around traveling using various methods and keeping track of birds. So acceptable methods of travel on a Christmas bird count are by foot, by car, snowshoe, cross-country ski, bobsled, boat. It doesn't matter how you travel as long as you're within the circle and counting birds. Feeder counters, contrary to the name, don't actually go around counting feeders, but rather do stationary counts, usually in their own backyards or a designated place where there are feeders, and they'll sample the bird diversity and abundance in that one location. Depending on the complexity of the circle, the number of field counters will vary and the amount of coverage they have will vary. Compilers are responsible for selecting a count date, organizing field effort, and entering data. I was introduced by Colin, who is a co-compiler for the Vancouver count. And so there's lots of different tasks for a compiler. And they're also the first level of defense for vetting records. So if somebody goes out and finds a rare bird or comes up with a bit of a wonky number, compilers will be the first sort of line of defense for quality control of the data. Christmas bird counts are often supported on a local scale by naturalist organizations like Nature Vancouver, the British Columbia Field Ornithologists, and they'll sort of post count dates, recruit participants, arrange for post count roundups or wrap ups as we call them, which are social events at the end of a Christmas bird count day where people sort of share their sightings and get together for some food. And then the next level of involvement is the regional editor. They have sort of the least fun job of all. So they'll go through all of the Christmas bird count circles for a defined region, usually a province, and they'll just vet the data again and just make sure that if there's any further documentation required, they'll reach out to compilers or the field counters and feeder counters to get more information. So all of these levels of involvement are important, and although people get involved at various levels, all of them are important. So why are we counting birds in the winter? Well, it just happens to be a good time of year. It's a good time to count birds, and the last part of our objective is to count birds. And winter is a great time because a lot of birds congregate during winter. So let's look at the surf scoter, for example, here. If you look at the breeding distribution of surf scoters, it's all throughout the Northern Shield, this peach colored area. and up to about tree line. And you'll find that they're very broadly distributed. If you've ever been up in this area during the breeding season, let's say June or July, there are like millions of lakes up here. And you'd be lucky to see a couple pairs of surf scoters, even with a great deal of coverage. In the winter, it's a different story. This photo was taken in English Bay here in Vancouver, and you can see that there are massive congregations of birds of many different species groups during winter. So you get a better idea of what's happening on a population level. Another familiar species in the Lower Mainland is the golden crowned sparrow. They breed throughout the alpine of Alaska, Yukon, into northern BC, and the Rocky Mountains of Alberta. Very difficult terrain to sample. So imagine if we wanted to get a good idea of their population, it'd be very difficult just because of the nature of the geography. Again, they're a common bird though during winter. Fraser Estuary, important bird area. And because birds tend to congregate during winter, there's pound for pound probably more birds here during winter than any other season. So keeping tabs on birds within these IBAs helps us establish and back up the importance of these areas, which can also be used and taken into consideration when addressing conservation concerns. Okay, so we know how CBC works, and we've established that it's an important time to monitor birds, but what's the point? Let's go back to that first issue of Bird Lore that I showed you earlier that features the CBC in 1901. And in the first passage, Chapman writes, and I quote, "The results of the census are both interesting and instructive. Interesting because they are definitive, comparative, and in a sense personal. Instructive because they give a very good idea of the distribution of winter birds on Christmas Day, with some indication of the number of individuals which may be observed in a given time." Period. So that's not only the longest sentence ever written. It also explains the vision of the Christmas bird count, which is the same to this day. Chapman even goes on to mention that the crossbills and somehow alludes to how this new undertaking is going to be useful for monitoring the eruptive nature of finches, which we're going to talk about a little bit as well. So Chapman said the results are interesting, definitive because data are collected in a standard way, comparative in that circles can be compared geographically because they're all conducted in the same manner, and personal, that part can be interpreted in a few different ways, but to me, it's a reference to the enjoyment that we get out of the survey itself as participants, an enjoyment of the tradition, the fellowship with other people, being outside, and being with the birds themselves. He goes on to say that the survey is instructive because it gives us this snapshot of bird diversity and abundance for a given location. And that's really important. And that snapshot, year after year, has given us very strong and useful long-term data set. You probably heard of a recent study in the journal Science that found that we've lost 3 billion birds compared to 50 years ago. In other words, there are almost 30% less birds at any given moment in time than there were in 1970. And CBC data were used and were an important part of the source for that study. For many of us who have been paying attention to birds, this avifauna crisis, as it's called, is not a surprise. Like, we've seen species decline, all over the place. But without the data to back up these studies, birds would be much worse off. Many other studies have been done using CBC data, including some looking at the effects of climate change. So this one study, I took a clipping from a news article, looked at the population of Canada geese overwintering in Calgary, and found that they increased 700% in 30 years, simply because of more open water along the Bow River. So these dramatic population changes undoubtedly have implications to the ecosystem and affect other species in ways that we're still trying to understand and still learning about. So CBC data help us understand the health of winter bird populations and their environments over time, and help us inform or guide conservation strategies. The CBC trends are actually available to anyone who goes to Audubon's website at audubon.org. So let's look at a few of these examples. Here we're looking at American crow, which are one of the top 10 species observed on Christmas bird counts in Canada. So the dark blue area indicates an increase of greater than 2.5% per year. And the bottom right is an abundance graph starting at in the mid 1960s to about present day. And so you can see with American crow, there's been a steady long-term increase, okay? Like Canada goose, they are also wintering further and further north. And the North American high counts for this species are coming from here in Southern Ontario. For the past 3 years, the Christmas bird count to record the most American crows has been in Southern Ontario, which is sort of a new northward moving trend. And this is obviously a species that has benefited from human disturbance. Rusty blackbird is an example of a species that we've all heard has been in trouble, okay? So the dark red indicates a decline of greater than 2.5% per year. And this map shows that the population across most of the range has declined pretty dramatically. Looking at the trend map, you can see that there was a drastic decline right here, just a big drop from the mid 1960s to about the mid 1980s, and the population just hasn't recovered since. Let's take a look at the American kestrel for a second. We know there are alarming declines in the east, but the regional data show that there are increases in the west. Maybe not as dramatic, but there are increases. And that might explain why when we look at the abundance chart here, it doesn't look like the population has really changed much, but they are disappearing from eastern North America. So some species fluctuate geographically, and this is another example of how the CBC data help us focus conservation efforts on geographical scales. Okay, now an opportunity to brag about being Canadian. Counts in Canada are really important for monitoring many species groups. The following groups are regularly contributing to the highest number of individuals for North America. We got Bohemian waxwing here, Canada jay, snow bunting. So species like the waxwing don't go further south than they need to. Okay, species like Canada jay are generally don't move around much at any time of the year, and most of their range is within Canada. And other non-migratory northern groups like woodpeckers, chickadees, and some of the hardy sparrows are also found in their greatest numbers during winter in Canada. Everyone loves owls, and we're fortunate to regularly record North American high counts for boreal, great gray, northern hawk, and snowy owl. So I was fortunate to grow up in southern Alberta where owling was excellent. And I have to say, it's one thing to go and like follow up on an owl that's being seen by a lot of people and a lot of photographers, but it's a very different experience just stumbling upon, you know, a number of great gray owls in one day. It's a spiritual experience. Another group of birds that are recorded in high numbers in Canada are the chickens, right? Like sharp-tailed grouse, spruce grouse, ruffed grouse, ptarmigan. Even established species like gray partridge and chukar that were widely introduced. You know, these are introduced established species, and they're far more abundant before, but now they've sort of retracted. All their ranges have retracted, and their strongholds are within Canada, believe it or not. And these are some quite sought after species, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
Many marine birds like dovekie, some cormorants, gulls, and some other shorebirds have strongholds in Canada. Some of the regular Eurasian species like black-headed gull and tufted duck are recorded on the East Coast regularly and sometimes in high numbers. I'm not sure if us Westerners are all as aware, but there were 78 tufted ducks on St. John's in one Christmas bird count in St. John's, and that would be 2013. Okay,
Wow.
365 black-headed gulls in Halifax, Dartmouth in 2005. We find one black-headed gull here on the West Coast, we lose our minds, and over there they're counting them in numbers. So it's incredible. And one last group I'll mention, and we were sort of talking about this before the presentation about how we're starting to notice eruptive species like the finches. And I was saying earlier that especially in Eastern North America, we've noticed that it's been a really good year for eruptive species, starting with nuthatches coming down, and then pine siskins, and then evening grosbeaks. Other species like crossbills are also showing up in good numbers, even more locally here. They've already showed up on the North Shore, and we're starting to see them around the Vancouver area. And as Colin pointed out, he has a Sitka spruce that's sort of loaded with cones. Just keep an eye on those cones all throughout the Lower Mainland here, because those crossbills might be showing up again very soon. Species like the hoary redpoll, like this was actually one that showed up here in Vancouver, Queen Elizabeth Park, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And this is one of the most northern wintering finches, and they really, again, don't go further south than they need to. So we really are sort of fortunate here in Canada that we get to see these species. White-winged crossbills. I mean, I don't know if everyone knows how incredible white-winged crossbills really are. I mean, they're tied to their food source, which are cones, obviously. But they'll actually nest at any time of the year, as long as food is available. Like they can be sitting on nests in January, February, as long as the cone crop is abundant. Here we have an abundance chart for an eruptive species. So you can see that eruptive species really don't follow any pattern from year to year, but we can sort of get trends over a longer period. And this is why it's important to continue with this, so that we can get even better idea. Like we really don't understand everything there is about how these eruptions work, right? And we're learning more and more. For example, with crossbills, they aren't necessarily tied to the north-south movements. We're finding that they move from east to west depending on where the cones are. So it's quite incredible. So another aspect of the Christmas bird count that really can't be understated is how important it is for tradition and for the community. I have personally really fond memories in my younger years when I would tag along with my mentor, pictured here, Gus Yaki in Calgary. Gus was a true CBC champion and like would literally do as many Christmas bird counts as physically possible, and did them right to the end of his days. And for many of us, it is, you know, this personal friendship, camaraderie, and fellowship that we look forward to year after year. For some of us, it's the only time we get to see some of our friends and share with this Christmas bird count tradition with them. So I really want to drive that point home. It's an important one. Unfortunately, in normal years, we would have count wrap-ups, which would be for many birders the most social time of the year, and we'll get together for food and drink. And that unfortunately isn't going to be happening this year, but it still is an important part of the Christmas bird count. And we can't forget that there are some really incredible places that these Christmas bird counts take us to. This alien-looking landscape here is Dinosaur Provincial Park in the Badlands of Alberta, where I was a compiler for my first Christmas bird count. And one thing I realized is I would never think of really visiting this place if it wasn't for the Christmas bird count. If I didn't have any other reason, I would never really. It's a great place to go, you know, especially during the breeding season and the warmer months. But during winter, I would rarely ever get out there. But this is actually a really great place for birds. Believe it or not, there's overwintering golden eagles in these valleys, and it's if it wasn't for the CBC, I wouldn't have known that. And when I think of community, I also think of the future, right? So CBCs offer a unique opportunity for us to engage with more people in the birding community, and to increase our community science outreach. For most parts of Canada, bird diversity is actually lower during winter. Birds are more visible, and often they can be observed in higher numbers since they often congregate. We're a little bit spoiled here in the Lower Mainland. There are a lot of birds and quite good diversity, but this can be a little bit overwhelming for people who are starting out, right? So throughout most of the country, the diversity is lower, and this is a really good time to introduce new people to birding, people of all ages. Often on a Christmas bird count, beginners are paired up with people who are more experienced, who can sort of show them the ropes. And this is a really great opportunity as well. Some people really get a kick out of, showing newbies around and sharing their enthusiasm and knowledge. And a special thank you to those people. You know who you are. You go out of your way to make sure that everyone feels welcome and to sort of promote our hobby. The Christmas bird count is an entirely separate event that caters to children and young families. It's becoming increasingly popular with events popping up all over Canada. And it really is, the events focus more on the educational aspect. So look forward to those. One question I'm often asked is, what's the difference between the Christmas bird count and eBird? And do we still even need the Christmas bird count in a world with eBird? The short answer is yes, there is a difference, and yes, we do need both. One of the most obvious differences between the CBC and general eBirding is extent of coverage. So I sort of broke down the habits of most eBirders myself into three categories, okay? Those who go to good birding spots, which are often established hotspots. Those who follow up on good sightings, for list keeping purposes. Nothing wrong with that, but that's where a lot of people spend their time. And those who bird their local patch and just areas, whether it's their yard or just somewhere close to home. Sometimes it's a hotspot close to home. And interestingly, due to the pandemic, this has become an even more and more popular approach to birding. So let's look at the map on the left here. These are Metro Vancouver eBird hotspots. The red and orange ones I want you to pay attention to. There are lots of blue and gray ones, which are technically hotspots, but they receive very little coverage. So it's really these red, orange, and yellow ones that receive a lot of checklist submissions. Okay, that's where people are going birding. And on the right, I pulled up records of golden crown sparrow for just the month of December last year. And you'll notice that there is a pattern of records that sort of aligns with these hotspots. And every little flame that you see here is a hotspot. So most people are going birding to hotspots, and that's where most of these records are coming from. So now let's look at the Ladner Christmas bird count overlaid. So you'll see, first thing, that there are lots of places where there's no coverage, even hotspot coverage, and no records of birds. It doesn't mean there aren't golden crown sparrows in all these places. It just means that we're not finding them because people are going wherever they want. So CBC provides a comparable overall estimate of bird diversity and abundance in an area, because we're dividing this area up and forcing people to go and count birds in these places. eBirding is much more variable, subject to how people want to collect their data. So anything goes with eBird. There's point counts, there's incidentals, longer traveling lists, and long stationary counts. But a CBC is a coordinated survey, okay, like the breeding bird survey. And it has coordinated effort. So in a perfect world, we would do both, really. We would submit our CBC coverage to eBird and contribute to the CBC. And if you're an eBird user, I do urge you to consider participating in the CBC and trying this out. You can actually keep track of your Christmas bird count using eBird and submit the data to your compiler that way. We can talk a little bit more about that. There are certain events like the Global Big Day and Great Backyard Bird Count that sort of take a little bit of the CBC aspect of the confined period of time to give us snapshots that are more comparable. So we can look at breeding, so we can look at winter bird abundance and diversity in a more comparable fashion. The Global Big Day, isn't a winter survey. There's one in the spring and one in the fall, but the Great Backyard Bird Count takes place in February. And I also urge people to consider doing more of the CBC style birding, which is just to go to places where everyone doesn't necessarily go. You know, that might mean staying local and looking at small green spaces near your where you live, especially these days for obvious reasons. And so these data are actually more useful than all of us just going to the same hotspot and birding the pants off of it. So for a bit of fun, what do these birds all have in common? We got a redwing, Siberian accenter, a fieldfare like this beautiful one here that was found in Salmon Arm. If you said that they're all Eurasian species, you would be right. And if you said that they're all species discovered on a Christmas bird count, you would also be right. But what you might not be thinking about is that they, for the most part, were found in places where people don't usually go birding, or at least locations that receive less coverage. Everyone knows that CBCs turn up goodies. It's large in part to this indiscriminate coverage that we just talked about. And these are just a few examples of the mega rarities that have been found or discovered on Christmas bird counts. So you have the Christmas bird count to thank, and those Christmas bird count participants to thank for all those rare birds that we all go chasing post Christmas bird count season. The more people involved in future Christmas bird counts, the more likely we're going to turn up these fun Christmas treats. I will say though, this is all fun, but rarities really aren't what the Christmas bird count is about. It's about monitoring the most common species, the ubiquitous species that are around, that we can record annually and derive these long-term trends that are useful for conservation and for environmental management. And that leads me to my final discussion point, which is what happens when something changes the effort or cancels a CBC altogether. Something like freak snowstorm or natural disaster or a pandemic, for example. And the answer is that the data set will not significantly be altered or otherwise compromised. And the reason for that is because we've got strength in this long-term data set now, right? So looking at this abundance graph again, if we were to completely erase 1 or 2 or even 3 years, it's not going to change the fact that this species has been monitored for so long, and we know that there's an increasing trend in abundance. And that's why it's important to continue this tradition and to continue monitoring them in the same way. So in addition, the abundance trends can account for changes in effort. So if there's, for whatever reason, less people participating in a Christmas bird count this year than usual years, there's an algorithm that we can use during analysis. So as long as we know the time spent and the distance covered, we can account for any changes in effort. So that means if the CBC it has either more or less participants, it's all accounted for. So the abundance trends are still useful. So looking back to this spring when the pandemic hit, the CBC seemed like it was a long way away, like we're not going to have to worry about that. But here we are on the doorstep of the Christmas bird count season coming up, and it really is still very much a concern. And we aren't 100% sure how it's all going to shake out, to be honest, within the next 3 weeks. But one thing for sure is that CBCs are going to look different for most people across Canada, and that it really won't be an event this year. So many of those community aspects that we talked about, the educational opportunities, anything that involves gathering, it just simply won't be possible this year. I just want to remind everybody that first and most importantly, your safety and the safety of those around you should be your priority. Always follow your local public health authority guidance. And if that means that there's no travel between cities or health units, then we shouldn't travel. And if that means that we won't get to participate in as many counts as we usually do or want to, then that means we don't. And obviously there are going to be no post-count gatherings or wrap-ups of any kind. We have additional measures in place to recommend how to do a COVID-safe Christmas bird count. Go to our website, birdscanada.org/CBC. And although it varies regionally, the most important thing is to follow our local health guidance. Having said all that, there is no pressure at all to participate this year in any capacity. And Birds Canada and the Audubon Society fully support anyone who chooses not to be involved. And that includes compilers who choose to cancel their count. There really is no pressure, and we know why, because if we lose data this year, it's not the end of the world for the CBC. Since it looks like we're all going to be hunkered down a little bit more than usual this winter, there are other accessible programs like the Project Feeder Watch that can be done from home. Take a look at Project Feeder Watch here, for example. You can go to our website, birdscanada.org/feederwatch. Project Feeder Watch runs from November through April, and it's a really good opportunity to introduce people to feeder watching, and it actually provides a lot of useful data, especially around how birds react to the urban environment. This is a perfect year to get involved with Feeder Watch because it's actually an eruption year. So you might find, evening grosbeaks at your feeder this year, or redpolls in years that we don't often get them. The Great Backyard Bird Count, another collaborative project, it takes place over 4 days in February, and you don't necessarily have to be confined to your yard. It can be your local patch or a spot you like to go birding. But what's important here is that because it is done similar to the CBC, done during a period of time that is repeatable every year, it gives us a snapshot of the diversity and abundance of birds year after year. So we can start to get these trends, these long-term trends. So some final thoughts on the Christmas bird count. So consider helping out on 1 or 2 counts if you don't already. Again, this is sort of my general advice, but don't worry about it this year. I'm speaking sort of generally. Consider eBirding your Christmas bird count results to eBird Canada. There is some helpful guidance on ebird.ca on how to do this, how you can actually use your mobile app to track where you are, where you're covering within your area on the Christmas bird count. And then the mobile app will summarize your checklists into a nice little spreadsheet that you can just send to your compiler. And I'm sure he'll be thankful rather than giving him a piece of paper with check marks on it. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but as we move forward with technology, sort of this is becoming a more and more useful way to do this. And many counts are using these methods of data entry. And a last reminder that if you are feeding birds, it's especially important to be responsible. And especially here in the Lower Mainland, the temperatures are a little bit warmer. Feeders can get dirty, and disease can be passed around among birds. So if we're gonna feed birds, please do so responsibly. Clean your feeders out every couple weeks. Consider planting bird-friendly plants around your house, which can offer food and cover to birds. Bird-friendly windows, you know the drill. Keep your cats indoors. And most importantly, please be safe. So thank you to everyone. I tried to keep this to 45 minutes, and so we have lots of time for questions. Thank you to everyone who's ever participated on a Christmas bird count over the years. Like I said, it just would not be possible without the thousands and thousands of people across Canada who volunteer on this program. And it's not too late to make the CBC part of your tradition, especially next year. So I'll leave it at that.